So my name is Joel Monegro. I'm a partner at a venture capital firm called Placeholder here in New York. And today, I am just going to throw a bunch of ideas at the wall and take advantage of all of you to brainstorm on some of the things that we've been thinking about over the last several months, particularly around governance. So all of these things are going to be half-baked ideas and are going to disappoint a lot of the engineers because they're not precise and they're very abstract, and there's zero math in this presentation. So, but just bear with me. So I will start by talking a little bit about Placeholder, just for you to have some context. Placeholder is, as I mentioned, a venture capital firm. My partner Chris Berniski is here with us, and we focus our practice on cryptoeconomics and governance. We try to invest early in teams that are in the process of building their networks and designing their networks, and we try to get involved and add as much value to that design process and to that management process from the beginning. And we've chosen to focus on those two aspects of crypto networks because it's what we love to do. We love to think about cryptoeconomics, we love to think about the economics of things, and we love to think about the governance. Now, a couple of years ago, I wrote a blog post called Fat Protocols that described that in the blockchain, you have most of the value going to the protocol layer, whereas in the web, you have most of the value going to the applications layer. And I maintain that. I think that is still correct, but a number of things were just wrong about that analysis. And in particular, it was this graphic that followed, which basically I argued that what made this, what allowed this to happen was that when there was any success at the application layer of the blockchain, then people would speculate or want to demand for the token of that blockchain, which would drive more activity in that ecosystem, leading to higher token price, and then there would be that loop. And the thing about that is that it's a little imprecise and incorrect, and it was underdefined and doesn't really get at the underlying drivers of long-term value for these networks. And as we've been thinking about it over the years, at least for me, I am increasingly convinced that it is tokens with governance that are going to capture most of the value in these crypto networks and in these protocols. And what I'm going to try and do today is walk through some of the ideas or some of the thoughts that are influencing this thesis. And over time, I hope that with more people thinking about these things, we're able to arrive at more precise ideas around why this is the case. So the bottom sentence here is a good place to start. The way to, or at least the way I like to think about governance tokens is they represent the power to change the rules of the game. What was great about the block science presentation is that it covered a lot of the design aspect of the game, but you made the very important point that we need systems for changing the rules of the game, and that it is impossible to design a perfect game from the start. And so the value of governance, or the value of having governance systems built into these blockchains, built into these architectures, is so that we have the tools to change the rules of the game when we recognize that we need to change some parameters or some of the rules. Now, the insight, or at least the intuition here, is that as crypto networks scale, so does the value of its overall economic activity. There's more people using these services, there's more miners, more workers, more users, more investors. But along with that, so does the cost and value of governing the network. It increases as well, because you have a lot more players in the game, and so there's just a whole bunch of reasons why the cost of governing becomes higher, because you have to coordinate with a larger group of people. And if you follow economics and just stick to the value of something equals its cost, if the cost of governing something increases over time, then the value of governing something increases over time. So what's interesting about tokens in certain kinds of crypto networks, and I define a crypto network as a decentralized information network powered by a token that provides a service. And decentralized is a particularly important side of these things. But what's interesting about tokens with governance is that they serve as both currency and capital. And the currency function provides the power to consume. It's a little bit more short-term geared because it's for consuming the service at a specific point in time. It's high frequency and high velocity. If we think about it from the monetary perspective, there's high frequency usage, or even high frequency investing if you're thinking about it from that perspective. And it's really the side of it serves the purpose of means of exchange and unit of account. We use these tokens to purchase a service. That's the consideration that we use to pay some miner somewhere for whatever service they're providing. And it's also the unit of account because it's the units of work are denominated in whatever internal currency a network has. But it also serves a capital function, which is a little bit more akin or similar to what we have in modern capitalism. It gives you the power to govern, the power to change the rules of the game, just as having equity in a company gives you voting power to change how that company works. Here, the token, when you mix them, or at least the governance function of a token, is really a capital function to make decisions. It's long-term focused, so the capital governance function of a token is much more geared towards the long term because you either hold in anticipation for a future rule change, or you hold because you want to make sure that for future proposals or for future changes you have a vote or a say in what's going to happen. It's low frequency and velocity because you're holding in anticipation for those future events or as a way to hedge for potential changes in the rules. And as you participate more in these networks and your stake really grows larger, you have even more of an interest to maintain that governance power, and you have more of an interest to maintain that voting power. So the velocity of that is really low. You're not trading on your power as much as you're trading on your usage of a service or your currency. And this really serves the long-term value, store of value aspect of these assets, where a main driver, at least we believe, when it comes to tokens that combine both currency and capital, or combine both currency and power, is really the most interesting way to think about capital, is this idea that over time, as the network grows and your participation in the network becomes more valuable, if you're a miner or a user or even an investor, then the incentive to hold these tokens over the long term becomes greater. So I'm going to spend most of my time in this slide. This is a framework that I like to use to think through a whole bunch of dynamics when it comes to crypto networks. And what's going on here is, I call this the circle of cryptoeconomic activity. And what it helps us do is understand the relationships between the different actors and the different roles within a crypto network, and then the different relationships of exchange between them. So I use Miner because I'm old school, but think of it as a worker, someone who's running the code or participating in the network and providing the service, the supply side of the network. There's the user, which is the person who's consuming the service, and then there's the investors. And one thing to note is that an individual can serve either one or all three of these roles at once. It's more about distinguishing the different things or the different roles that people have. Miners, I'll just repeat it for a little bit. Miners provide the service, users demand the service, and investors, what they do is provide liquidity. And we'll go through this in a little bit. And then there's three relationships of exchange between these three kinds of roles. There's the miner-user exchange, which is an exchange between tokens and some unit of work, some service. There's the user-investor exchange, which is an exchange between tokens and some form of external capital. Let's just use dollars for now. And then there's the miner-investor exchange, which is also an exchange between tokens and capital, but the other way around. So what's going on here is, just very broadly and very abstractly, miners and users are trading work for tokens. Users and investors are trading capital for tokens, and miners and investors are also trading capital for tokens. But the user basically gets, when they demand tokens to consume the service, they get it from sort of the investor pool that's providing that liquidity. But there can always be a miner that's selling, that's fulfilling the role of investor and fulfilling the role of liquidity, and so on. On the other side, the miner-investor exchange happens when the miner has received tokens, has received their revenue or their income in tokens, but they need to finance the cost of providing the service. And so for Bitcoin, for example, you're operating a mining operation, you're paying electricity in dollars, you're paying your employees in dollars, and so on. At some point, you need to turn those tokens, those Bitcoins into dollars so that you can actually finance this operation. And the investors help facilitate that exchange on both sides. You can have long-term investors and short-term investors. The short-term investors, more hedge fund style, will provide more of that immediate liquidity. The long-term investors will do more of a set the long-term value of, or help set the long-term value of a network. So with this framework, there's a couple of things that I want to point out or brainstorm around. One is, first, it's important to see where the blockchain sits in these relationships or in this diagram. and it sits at that miner user exchange. And what a blockchain does, or a protocol at this point, is regulate that exchange, make sure that it standardizes the service, and it enforces how this product is built and delivered to the user. And that is what allows the users to have confidence in the service, and it allows for miners to be able to come on and off because it's very well defined and everyone's providing the same service. It's also worth noting that I only have one sort of caricature for each one, but there's obviously, if it's a decentralized network, there's, well, not thousands, but there's several users, several miners, several investors. The interesting thing about, at least how I like to think about this, is that I intentionally put the tokens kind of in the inside of the circle and capital and work on the outside of the circle. And that is interesting to me because it kind of hints at what blockchains do. It's a new way of mediating capital and work in an interesting way, in a self-regulating way. But what's really happening at the end of the day, when you complete all the cycles and all the loops, you've exchanged work for capital, and that's not very different from the way the economy works today. Now, I'm going to start and try to bring this back to the value of governance in these networks by thinking about how scale affects these relationships and affects the incentives of each one of these participants. So scale can come in many different ways. If we think of scale as just the general overall growth of the network, you can have growth on the miner side, you can have growth on the user side, you can have growth on the investor side. Starting with the user side, if you have growth in users, there's more users coming to the service because it's valuable for whatever reason, then there's increasing demand for the token, which they get from the investor pools, and that increases demand from investors, which attracts more investors, but it also increases demand for miners because it attracts more miners, that there's more value to this network. You can also have growth and scale on the miner side where more people are coming to the infrastructure to provide the service. And when you have a governance token or a token that provides governance, that will actually increase the demand for tokens as a store of value, because a miner or a worker that's coming to this network and providing value and getting their revenues in that token is going to be, over time, as the network scales, more interested in maintaining that status and maintaining their ability to govern and influence the network, hence pulling more tokens out of the trading flow and hoarding them in a way in order to protect their role of the network. And understanding these things starts to hint at some of the reasons why the governance function is so valuable and why the governance function is the driver for long-term value growth. Because when you're a miner, really, and this shows up in a whole bunch of different ways. There's many different ways to design these networks. One common way is where the token is used to stake, to be part of a service or to provide a service. So for example, in Filecoin's design, every storage provider has to lock up a certain amount of Filecoin, and that gives them an ability to provide a certain amount of storage. When you have more and more miners come onto the network, then you're pulling more and more of that out of the float. And so over time, as the network scales, you just think about this value circle going around. More and more tokens are getting pulled out from the float and sort of in the miner's reserve in a way, but also from the long-term investors. As the activity is picking up, you've got more investors like, say, Placeholder saying, okay, this is one way to underwrite the growth of the network, is to help set the long-term value, and one way to help set the long-term value is buying tokens and holding them at zero velocity, because we're targeting a higher future value. But at the end of the day, there's still just an exchange between work and capital that is very interesting that we can program and design. I'm going to come back to this chart, but I want to go touch on some of the other ideas before we go into brainstorm mode. I want to make an observation about why this is so important, or why these dynamics are so different from what we have in the world today, and what's the opportunity here. And it starts with an observation, which is that separating currency and capital leads to concentration. Concentration of many kinds, but for our purposes, concentration of wealth and power. So in modern capitalism, if you think about it, we've separated those two roles. We have currency, currencies usually provided by governance, and we have capital, which exists in many different ways, say equity in companies being one of the most common ones. And the problem is that most people live their lives in currency, and few people live their lives in capital. And this is something that Marx observed, and many other economists and socialists observed, but no one seems to have really isolated this separation of asset classes where what the reason this leads to concentration is that currency and capital respond very different to economic growth, at least economic growth as measured by inflation, in that currencies tend to lose value over time, whereas capital tends to increase in value over time. And as capital increases in value over time, the incentive to hoard it increases over time, but capital is fairly scarce relative to currencies which can be printed in any capacity. And so that, I believe, leads to the massive concentration of wealth and power that we're seeing today. Especially if you start thinking of capital as power, as really the ability to organize things and the ability to change the rules of a company, to change the rules of an industry, and so on. And the model of the circular flow of the cryptoeconomic circle, I really stole it from my Econ 101 book back from college, where they teach you in economics, they teach you about the circular flow of economic activity as it works today in modern capitalism. It's described as this sort of very clean model where, hey, look, there's individuals and there's businesses, and individuals sell their time to businesses in exchange for money, and then they use that money to buy from businesses and so on. But then the thing about this model is that it misses that observation that the asset class that governs businesses, or the asset class that accrues value, is really the equity in the businesses, and the currency that's used to compensate the individuals depreciates over time. And so as this model of capitalism, as that model grows and scales, you have concentration of wealth on the side of the capital ownership of the businesses, and you have devaluing of wealth on the individual side of the business. So the intuition here is that combining capital and currency in the same asset, which is what we're doing in a lot of these networks, is going to lead to greater levels of scale. And this is where it's all very abstract, and this is where I need help really narrowing this down. But it feels to me that one of the limits of capitalism is precisely this tendency to concentrate. And it's something that many economists have observed over time, and it takes place over a long period of time. But there's something, concentration begets concentration. And when you concentrate capital into fewer and fewer hands, allocating that capital becomes more and more inefficient because the decision-making power is in the hands of a smaller group of people. And the result of that is that we end up allocating capital less efficiently, and we're not optimizing for scale in the same way that we would be if capital were spread out more evenly. And what's neat about this model, or at least this way of looking at things, is that by combining currency and capital into the same asset that you use to both govern and control, and the asset that you use to consume and transact, the consumption and transactional function of the token in a way helps redistribute the value of that system more broadly across all participants in these microeconomies, where the users also benefit from the growth of the value of the service, because if the token is the thing that appreciates and everyone is holding the same asset, then everyone is participating in that value growth. Whereas in the modern economy, as the economic activity picks up, the business owners or the capitalists are benefiting a lot more than the individuals. And I think that where we're heading with all of this is a new kind of, a new mode of production for the information economy. I like to call it crypto capitalism because it combines a lot of elements of classical capitalism, like free markets and competition and access to information and so on. But with this crypto layer, we're able to really fine-tune it to our purposes or to specific goals by defining rules of the game. And this new mode of production is really based on, whereas capitalism is based on capital ownership and labor, this one is based on cryptoeconomic consensus and running code. And instead of going to the state for regulation, these are self-regulating markets in their own way, because the economy itself, the participants in each one of these economies, have the ability to vote or to regulate these systems, but also more broadly as a whole, given the structure of these networks, the market serves as the regulator in its own way, both internally when you have a network where the users or the miners or the investors have an ability to exercise some governance power, but also on the market level, because all of these things are open source and these are open data layers. And so a fork, for example, is one way for the market to enforce one regulation in a way, or to at least maintain some kind of order. So I just went through a whole bunch of things that are not very well tied together, but I hope that at least some of these ideas stick and help you, the engineers, think about the importance of building in governance features into the networks and into the tokens as a way to optimize for long-term value and growth.